Picture this. A North American B-25 Mitchell streaks across the burning skies over the Philippines, its right engine trailing a ribbon of orange flame that stretches 50 feet behind the aircraft. Inside the cockpit, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph "Iron Joe" Bean grips the controls as fire consumes his starboard right R-2600 engine, yet somehow the twin-engine bomber continues flying. For most pilots, this would be the end of the story, a forced bailout over hostile territory and certain death or capture. But for Iron Joe and his five-man crew of the 42nd Bombardment Squadron, this was just the beginning of the most harrowing survival flight in Pacific theater history. January 15, 1945. Clark Field, Philippines. The war against Japan was entering its final, desperate phase, and American B-25 Mitchells were flying round-the-clock missions against Japanese supply lines throughout the South Pacific. Lieutenant Colonel Bean, a 28-year-old veteran from Kansas with over 100 combat missions, was leading a formation of 12 Mitchells on what should have been a routine bombing run against Japanese shipping in Manila Bay. The B-25J Mitchell Devil's Own was one of the most advanced medium bombers in the American arsenal. Serial number 44 to 28694, she had been built at North American Aviation's Kansas City plant and delivered to the 42nd Bombardment Squadron in late 1944. Powered by twin Wright R-2600-92 Cyclone engines producing 1,700 horsepower each, the Mitchell carried a six-man crew and bristled with defensive armament, up to 18.50 caliber machine guns that could tear apart any fighter foolish enough to attack her. Iron Joe had earned his nickname not through recklessness, but through the methodical precision that kept him and his crews alive mission after mission. His crew included co-pilot First Lieutenant Mike Sullivan from Boston, bombardier navigator Lieutenant Harry Chin from San Francisco, flight engineer Technical Sergeant Bob Wrench Murphy from Detroit, radio operator Staff Sergeant Tony Scalise from Brooklyn, and tail gunner Sergeant Jimmy Kid Thompson, barely 19 years old, from rural Alabama. The mission briefing had been routine. Intelligence reported a Japanese convoy attempting to evacuate troops from Luzon to Formosa under cover of darkness. 12 B-25s would attack at first light, using the low-level skip bombing techniques that had made the Mitchell the most feared ship killer in the Pacific. The plan was simple: approach at wavetop height, release their bombs to skip across the water like stones, and withdraw before Japanese fighters could respond. Devil's Own carried 4 500-pound general-purpose bombs in her internal bay, plus enough fuel for the 3-hour round trip to Manila Bay and back. Her twin R-2600 engines had been recently overhauled by Sergeant Murphy himself, and every system had been checked and double-checked. As far as Iron Joe knew, this would be mission number 127, just 3 short of the magical 130 that would rotate him home to Kansas and a hero's welcome. The formation took off into the pre-dawn darkness, their twin engines echoing across the Philippine countryside as they climbed to cruising altitude. For 2 hours they flew in perfect formation, navigation lights dimmed to avoid Japanese night fighters. The weather was clear, the engines ran smoothly, and everything suggested another successful mission for the veteran bomber squadron. As they approached Manila Bay, the formation descended to attack altitude, barely 50 feet above the wave tops. This was where the Mitchell earned its reputation as a ship killer. Flying so low that spray from the waves sometimes struck their propellers, the B-25s could approach enemy vessels undetected by radar until it was too late for effective defensive fire. Iron Joe spotted the Japanese convoy through the morning haze, 6 cargo ships escorted by 2 destroyers, exactly as intelligence had predicted. The ships were making desperate speed toward the safety of Manila Harbor, their wakes creating white V patterns across the dark blue water. This was going to be a textbook skip bombing attack. Devil's Own rolled into her bombing run, Bean lining up on the largest cargo vessel while his bombardier prepared to release their 4 500-pound bombs. The Japanese ships erupted in defensive fire. Anti-aircraft guns aboard the destroyers and machine guns on the merchant vessels created a deadly web of tracers across the attack corridor. But the B-25s had faced worse. Flying at nearly 300 miles per hour just above the waves, they were difficult targets for enemy gunners. Bean felt Devil's Own shudder slightly as a few rounds found their mark, but the damage seemed minor. Lieutenant Sean released their bombs perfectly, and Bean pulled up sharply to avoid the explosions as their ordnance skipped across the water and detonated against the cargo ship's hull. The attack was a complete success. All 4 bombs found their target, and the Japanese vessel was already listing heavily to starboard as Devil's Own climbed away from the carnage. Bean was congratulating his bombardier when the first sign of trouble appeared, a red warning light on the engine instrument panel. "Skipper, we've got a problem with number 2, called out Sergeant Murphy from his flight engineer's station. Oil pressure dropping fast, and temperatures climbing into the red zone. Bean's eyes snapped to the starboard engine instruments. The radar 2600 was indeed in distress. Oil pressure had dropped from normal 85 pounds per square inch to barely 30, while cylinder head temperature was climbing past the maximum allowable limit. Worse, he could see wisps of smoke beginning to trail from the engine cowling. "Feather number 2 and secure the engine," Bean ordered, following the emergency checklist that every bomber pilot had memorized. Murphy immediately moved the propeller control to feather position and shut off fuel flow to the starboard engine. The massive 4-bladed propellers slowly wound down to a stop, its blades aligned with the airflow to reduce drag. But something was terribly wrong. Even with the engine shut down and the propeller feathered, smoke continued pouring from the starboard nacelle. Worse, the smoke was getting thicker and darker, and Bean could see the first flickers of actual flame beginning to lick around the engine cowling. "Fire in number 2. Murphy shouted, his voice tight with tension. "Activating fire suppression system." The B-25's built-in fire suppression system discharged its load of carbon dioxide into the burning engine compartment, but the flames only grew larger. Within minutes, the entire starboard engine was engulfed in fire, with orange flames streaming 50 feet behind the aircraft like a comet's tail. This was every bomber crew's nightmare scenario. An engine fire in flight was usually fatal. The flames would either consume the aircraft structure or detonate the fuel tanks within minutes. Standard procedure was immediate bailout before the aircraft broke apart or exploded. But Bean faced a problem that made bailout impossible. Devil's Own was still over Japanese-controlled territory, 200 miles from the nearest Allied base. Below them stretched the hostile waters of the South China Sea, patrolled by Japanese submarines and rescue vessels. Even if the crew successfully bailed out, their chances of survival were virtually zero. They would either drown in the ocean or be captured by Japanese forces, and everyone knew the fate of captured American airmen in Japanese hands. Bean made a split-second decision that would define the next 2 hours of their lives. Instead of ordering his crew to bail out, he would attempt to fly the burning bomber home to Clark Field. It was an almost suicidal gamble, but it was their only chance of survival. "We're staying with the ship," Bean announced over the intercom. "Everybody strap in and prepare for emergency procedures. Murphy, I need everything you can give me from number 1 engine. We're flying home on a wing and a prayer." Flying a twin-engine bomber on one engine was challenging under the best circumstances. Doing it with the other engine on fire was virtually impossible. The B-25's flight characteristics changed dramatically with only half its normal power available. The aircraft wanted to yaw constantly toward the dead engine, requiring continuous pressure on the rudder pedals to maintain straight flight. Worse, the fire was spreading. What had started as flames around the engine cowling was now consuming the entire starboard wing root. Bean could feel the heat through the cockpit wall, and the acrid smell of burning aluminum and hydraulic fluid filled the cabin. The fire was eating through control cables, electrical wiring, and fuel lines, any of which could cause catastrophic failure at any moment. The crew worked with desperate efficiency to keep their dying aircraft airborne. Co-pilot Sullivan took over navigation duties, plotting the most direct course to Clark Field while constantly monitoring engine instruments. Murphy adjusted fuel flow and engine settings to extract maximum performance from their remaining right R-2600, running it at power levels far beyond normal operational limits. In the rear of the aircraft, the gunners watched helplessly as the fire consumed more and more of the starboard wing. Radio operator Scalise transmitted continuous position reports to rescue forces, knowing that if Devil's Own finally broke apart, at least search aircraft would know where to look for survivors. The fire burned with terrifying intensity, fed by leaked hydraulic fluid and electrical insulation. Pieces of burning metal began breaking away from the wing and streaming past the cockpit windows. The entire right side of the aircraft was now engulfed in flames that reached back past the tail section. Yet somehow the basic structure held together. Bean flew with the skill born of over 100 combat missions, using every trick he had learned to keep the Mitchell airborne. He adjusted power settings constantly to compensate for the changing weight distribution as fuel burned off and pieces of the aircraft fell away. When the fire damaged the hydraulic system, he switched to manual controls that required enormous physical strength to operate. Mile after agonizing mile passed beneath them as Devil's Own limped towards safety. The fire showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it seemed to grow larger as more systems failed and more fuel fed the flames. The heat in the cockpit became nearly unbearable, forcing the crew to work in shifts as they rotated away from the worst of the temperature. Navigation became critical as the aircraft's radio compass and other electronic systems succumbed to fire damage. Sullivan used dead reckoning and celestial navigation to maintain course, knowing that any navigational error could send them hundreds of miles off course over the vast Pacific Ocean. After 1 hour of flight, the fire had consumed most of the starboard wing's internal structure. Control response was becoming increasingly sluggish as cable tensions changed and control surfaces warped from heat damage. Bean was flying an aircraft that was literally falling apart around him, held together by nothing more than willpower and engineering redundancy. The worst moment came during the second hour when the fire reached the wing fuel tanks. Bean and his crew braced for the explosion that would end their ordeal instantly, but the tanks had already been emptied and the fire simply burned through the aluminum without finding enough vapor to ignite. They had dodged death by minutes, perhaps seconds. As they approached the Philippine coast, Sullivan spotted the welcome sight of Clark Field's runway complex through the heat haze. They had made it across 200 miles of open ocean in a burning aircraft that should have disintegrated an hour ago, but their ordeal wasn't over yet. They still had to land a barely controllable bomber with major structural damage. Being called the control tower and declared an emergency. Crash crews and ambulances rushed to positions along the runway as Devil's Own lined up for her final approach. The approach had to be perfect. There would be no second chance with an aircraft this badly damaged. The landing was a testament to pilot skill and aircraft engineering. Despite the fire damage and asymmetric weight distribution, Bean managed to touch down smoothly on Clark Field's main runway. The Mitchell rolled to a stop in a cloud of smoke and steam as fire crews rushed forward with foam and water. The crew evacuated rapidly through the main entry hatch as firefighters battled to extinguish the flames that had been their constant companion for over 2 hours. When the fire was finally out and damage assessment began, investigators could hardly believe what they found. The entire starboard engine and wing root had been consumed by fire. Control cables were melted, hydraulic lines destroyed, electrical systems completely burned out. By all rights, Devil's Own should have broken apart within minutes of the fire starting. The fact that she had flown for over 2 hours in this condition defied every engineering calculation. But the real miracle was the crew. Despite flying in what amounted to a flying furnace for over 2 hours, not one man had been seriously injured. Iron Joe Bean and his 5-man crew had survived an ordeal that should have killed them all, proving once again that courage, skill, and superior aircraft design could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The incident became legendary throughout the 42nd Bombardment Squadron and the entire 5th Air Force. Devil's Own was too badly damaged for repair and was written off as a total loss, but her crew continued flying missions until the end of the war. Iron Joe Bean eventually completed his 130 missions and returned home to Kansas, where he lived quietly as a farming equipment dealer, rarely talking about the day he flew a burning bomber home. For the men who flew B-25 Mitchells in the Pacific Theater, the story of Devil's Own became proof of what North American aviation had built, an aircraft so tough, so well-engineered, that it could survive damage that would destroy any other bomber. The Mitchell had earned its reputation the hard way, bringing crews home when any other aircraft would have failed. This is the story of the B-25 that flew home while on fire for 2 hours, and proved that sometimes American engineering and raw courage can overcome even the laws of physics themselves.